One of the things I'm working on is relocating the heater bypass control, and just wanted to bring it up that there's actually two styles for the G bodies. This one has the ports coming straight through, so if you look at it, this one has them at an angle. So if you look, you get one port that's offset. Don't know what the rationale is. I'm sure there's some kind of clearance problem, maybe for the master cylinder booster. I'm not sure, but if you're ordering these, make sure you go to Rock Auto or somewhere and get an actual picture of what you're getting so that you get the right one. I'm staying with the straight. Normally, well, the way they work is, if you think of it, get these in orientation. If you bring these two ports down, they will be passed through. So in other words, the top port in will be the top port out, bottom port in will be the bottom port out. If you put vacuum on this and close it, you're basically splitting off the center line so that you get circulation through these two ports and circulation through these two ports. So I'm not really sure if you put it on backwards if there would be a problem, because as long as you orient the plumbing, it's going to be in and out on one side and in and out on the other. And of course you're only pumping through one side, so the other side's just sitting there dead at the heater core. But this brings me up to a dilemma in that instead of locating this up in this area like the factory did, I'm actually thinking of getting it out of the way. Number one, it doesn't really go with the looks of the car. I've got a lot more clearance now that the booster is out, but I think I want to relocate it down under the radiator. And that's going to bring up all kinds of complications as far as the plumbing, but in reality it might make life easier for some other things. So I'm thinking of tentatively going here, flipping it this way, I'm not sure. But I was also thinking of putting the vacuum can up over here, and the controls would be through a thin tube that would have to run up, and then on my heater hoses would have to run down along the bottom of the frame to be out of the way. And I can use aluminum tubing. I was in the junkyard the other day and found that the minivans and PT cruisers and things had long aluminum tubes running down through the transmission tunnel. So I'm thinking of doing something like that, where I'm going to come down out of the heater core along the bottom of the front frame rails and over to here, and then back up to the thermostat housing and to the output of the electric pump. I'm putting in a Davies Craig pump in here. I'm going to change this bottom flange to be straight and go right into the pump. And of course I didn't bring that down with me. So my plan here is I'll come out of the radiator. So this is the input to the pump. Then the bottom hose would come over and up in to the input. And of course the heater core would come out of the bottom of the thermostat housing, go up to the heater core, back and into the radiator hose that's in here. So of course that means days of trial and error until I figure out the exact design, but that's the fun of working on cars. You just modify them and figure out how to do it. So I'm going to mount this diverter valve for the heater core, and I was trying to figure out a way to mount it, and I came up with, there's a nice nipple on the back. So I drilled out a piece of aluminum, put the nipple in, Then I'll put a tie wrap around it. So there, it's mounted. All I got to do now is find a place to bolt it and what length to make my bracket. But that should hold it securely and make a nice setup. I got this heater hose off a PT Cruiser. It's Gates 19437. And the reason I did was I need something to come off the heater core, but instead of coming straight out, I want to make it a 90 degree and send it down. So when I looked at the PT Cruisers, the input and the output hoses, although they list as different part numbers, look almost identical. And I can cut that right at the center line and I'll get two hoses out of it. I'll have 90 degrees or barbs, whatever I want, but it'll make it nice for what I'm looking to do as far as hiding the hoses out of the way. And I can put some nylon braided wrap around them. So that's my plan, but I think any PT Cruiser should work. The nice thing about these hoses, going with a 5/8 ID heater hose is if you take a 12AN fitting the nut fits right over it. A little bit of grease. You can make an AN connection out of a 5/8 heater hose. If I put the nylon braiding over that first, it'll lock it in under the nut. So that's my plan, and that should help me to get the heater controls out of the way, a remote location, so that you won't see them. One thing I'm using to make the end of the hose that goes to a hose clamp look like an AN fitting are these fake, I guess you call them finishing clamps. They've got a small hose clamp inside and they look pretty convincing. This one's too curved, obviously, but you put braiding on that like this and you can make that look like a regular braided hose like this. And in this case I've got a small spot to do. They look pretty good. About $5 a piece. Get them on Amazon. You just have to make sure you get the hose clamp down out of the way. They don't like to be tightened and untightened that much. 1 or 2 times is all you get, and then you lose the hose clamp and you have to replace it. But they work really nice. You do have to take them apart. If you have to replace a hose clamp, the end comes off. You can get at the hose clamp. You put a new one in, or even a fatter one if you want. Alright, I've made up this 12AN hose with 12AN fittings, obviously. This has an internal diameter of about 5/8 of an inch. So even though the fittings are rated in every 1AN is 1/16 of an inch, so 5 5/8 hose is 10/16 of an inch, so it should be a 10 AN. Even though that's the case, these 12 AN fittings fit on nicely. I was actually going to use this type of a push-on fitting, so I bought it in 12 AN. Put a little background behind it. But the problem is the barbs on it are 3/4 of an inch, which is 12/16, therefore 12 AN. This fitting is 12 AN, but so is this end of it. And ironically, if you went to a standard fitting, not the push-on type, if I take the end that goes into the hose off, this will actually go into a 5/8 hose. So a little word of warning when you're buying AN fittings and mixing them with heater hoses: if you've got a 5/8 heater hose and you buy a 12 AN fitting, it will go right into the heater hose. Even though this is a 5/8 hose, which should be 10 AN, the 10 AN will go in here with too much slop. This is a 10 AN fitting, and it goes in actually pretty nicely. But you won't be able to get the nut over it. And that's the problem you run into if you're running a 5/8 hose and you want to use a 10 AN fitting. The male end will go into the hose, but the female end will not go over it. So you're going to run up into a problem. So in that case, you can go to this barb type. So a 5/8 hose, go with a 10 AN barb, and you can go into there, but you're going to be 10 AN on this side. So keep in mind that you lose diameter inside that fitting. So even though the outside would be 10 AN, the inside, or the outside would be 5/8, the inside would be smaller. So you're going down in size. So everything is just decreasing, 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 and you're really not going to get the flow that you want out of your fittings. That's why I've gone to 12 AN. I get much more flow out of this. Measuring the internal hole size in a 12 AN, these are the evil energies, and that's almost 6/10 of an inch. It's 0.56 something, 565 I think. So I've got a nice hole size, but if I went to a different company's fitting, this is actually a 0.47 inch internal ID. So just the fittings themselves, even though these are both 12 ANs, you're not getting the same flow from them. And it's only a 1/10 of an inch, yes, but a 1/10 of an inch in diameter can be huge in the amount of flow that you're going to get. And this is for the heater hose. So I'm okay with this as far as the less in flow. But if you're looking to size things up for flow, just keep that in mind, that you don't really know what the internal size of a fitting is going to be just by knowing the AN size of it. Two different companies are going to give you two different results. Just to give you an idea of what I'm doing, this is the aluminum radiator I bought for Summit. I've cut two flanges off it, the 1.5 inch that's at the top and the 1 3/4 that was at the bottom. So I put a 90-degree 1.5 inch neck on it and a 16 AN. This is a 16 AN threaded fitting at the top. So for the bottom, I've got this adapter. That's going to be the return line from the heater core for the hot water. And then from there, it goes into the electric water pump. So this will be at the base of the radiator. And of course, it'll all be mounted so that it's supported. That's my plan. Hopefully this weekend I'll have it in the car. It's almost comical, the stupid things you can do to get yourself in a jam. I had gone through and replumbed the heater hose lines So that they're all braided, they look pretty. They come down through over the transmission, down under the radiator. As you can see, they come down from the transmission, go into the bypass valve. I have to run a vacuum line to that. One line comes to the input of the water pump, and the other one's going to go to the thermostat housing. And that way, if the thermostat, if you shut the heater off, it'll flow out of the thermostat, around and back into the water pump from just the heater, the thermostat portion of the heater core. And then the main radiator will still flow down into the water pump after it's been cooled. As I said earlier, I've got the hoses mocked up, kinda coming out of or back to the engine. This is the input of the engine. So it comes out of the water pump. I've got a hose coming in hopefully today or tomorrow. That'll get me up to the water pump. This is the water pump, but where the water pump would have been. So far so good. The problem comes in, I put AN fittings on my radiator instead of leaving it stock. And that was my mistake, because what I didn't count on is using 16 AN fittings. They not only get fatter, they get longer. And I had this figured that I could do it and make them meet. Well, there's no way this hose is going to go between those fittings. So I thought, well, maybe I can get two 90s, but then your 90s are going to come out and they're probably going to be off by an inch or two, and there's no way you can, with just a small portion of hose, you're going to make them meet. So that was one of those oh crap moments, and I just gave up. I've learned in the past that when you run into a major problem like this, just quit, go in the house and forget about it for a while. So I got thinking about it overnight, and I've got this turbo line coming back to the thermostat housing. But the other thing that I've done is, years ago I had reverse cooled this engine, and my plan was to just use that as the 4-cylinder coolant passage coming back to the thermostat. Now I think what I'm going to do is eliminate this hose and actually come out of the end of the head, so the coolant will flow the entire length of the head, come out into the radiator. So I'll put a 90 in here. It'll come back like so. So that should be a workable solution. The question comes in, all right, I'm not worried about the turbo hose, because that's more for when you shut the engine off to let the coolant flow through the turbo. So when it's active, it really doesn't use that hose anyway. So we'll leave that in place. As I said, this one will be eliminated. I'll put an AN fitting on there. And I thought, well, how can I do that? Because I won't have a thermostat. So that's going to keep me from doing it. But I realized I'm using an electric water pump, not the original water pump that used to be over here. So with that being the case, I don't need a thermostat, because it's going to monitor the engine temperature with a sensor similar to this one. And then when it needs to turn on and off, it'll just cycle the electric pump, whatever it needs. So essentially I'm going to eliminate that. And I've actually got a heater bypass plate that I made up years ago, so I can throw that back in. I still have the output for the heater core is being here under the thermostat housing. I'm not sure about that, but I think that'll still work, because you're going to still get flow through the head. So whether it comes out of here or out of here really doesn't make much difference, not for the heater core. and it's not like it's a winter car anyway. So I think that I've got a workable solution. If you watched the previous videos, you probably heard me mention Evil Energy fittings and hoses. I got this catch can, sweet deal. I think it was 38 bucks for the can with the filter and the drain valve on the bottom. So if you're interested, I've got the oil catch can mounted, and it'll take one fitting to run up to the valve cover so that any of the fumes coming out of there will go down to the can. I'm kind of up in the air whether I want to put a vacuum line on to run back to the intake, but I don't think I will. I don't think it really needs suction. It's got a vent filter here. I'll just block off one port and only run one in, and that way if there's any positive pressure it'll go into the catch can, otherwise it'll stay in the engine. One of the things I use quite a bit are these nut certs. All they are is you drill a hole through a panel and then you thread in your bolt and crush it. I've got a tool that does this, kind of like a rivet tool, but if you have a tight spot that you can't get into very easily, you can make one real simple. This is a 1-inch piece of round stock, and it's got a hole about 10 millimeters, 3/8 of an inch in it. And this is an 8 millimeter rib nut. So all you do is you get a washer, a bolt that's long enough to go through the stock, but to have threads all the way up, and then you can put your rib nut on. Get that tight with your fingers, and then a pair of vice grips. And if you have a flat panel, put that through the panel, put pressure against the panel, and then with a wrench start cranking on it. And that'll actually crush the rib nut so that it's squeezing the panel on both sides, and then you can just undo it. So if you don't have the rib nut tool, you can just buy the rib nuts and put washers on both sides. It doesn't really matter. Actually, I think it does. You want this side to have contact against the rib nut so that when you're putting pressure, you're putting friction on this side. But this side, you can have space as long as you got one washer, 2, 3, it doesn't really matter. But you want to make sure that you've got threads all the way so that the rib nut does not bottom out on the shoulder of the bolt. So if it bottoms out on the shoulder, then you'll have problems. But you can see there's a lot of depth before that would happen. Pretty easy to do. I also suggest using a hardened bolt. You don't want to have something soft strip out on you, even though this isn't. I'd also go for the aluminum rib nuts. Much easier to crush. If you're getting the steel, you're in for some work. Decided to mount the vacuum storage canister over on the passenger side behind the fuel vapor canister. So they're both up under the fender. I don't know if you can see that properly or not.